This is the second of two videos about fisheries. This one is going to focus on the problems and their solutions. Problems with fisheries obviously have to do with human activities because we're using them. And really one of the biggest issues is bycatch. Bycatch is when you're taking an organism and catching it, and it's not the organism that you intended. So there are two different types of bycatch. In one situation, what most people would think of is when we're talking about a non-target species. So, for example, catching a sea turtle when you're trying to catch, I don't know, tuna or something like that. Doesn't have to be endangered, but anytime you're catching something you don't want, it's harming, possibly killing the other organism, and that can have big impacts on an ecosystem if you're doing too much of that. The other is more of an issue for the species and the population itself of your target species, and that's when you're taking organisms like juveniles or females of the target species, and that impacts the reproduction of the population that you're targeting. You're basically not letting that species replenish itself. Juveniles have never had a chance to reproduce, so taking them out means that there's absolutely no reproductive capacity on their part. And females are usually considered sort of the limiting factor because a single male can fertilize many females. So if we catch the males, it's not as big a problem as long as there are a few left, whereas taking several of the females and not leaving very many really significantly reduces the ability of that population to rebound from the fishing activities itself. And because of that, and because of the demand, we have some very serious issues with overfishing globally. These are images of a bunch of graphs from very different regions of the world, and in all situations we have the stock, the population being fished, and we can see that the catch per unit effort, meaning the amount of fish you catch for every hour spent, has drastically dropped over time. And this is just looking at a 20-year time span on this one, but other species have been caught, other regions, they've been looking at it for longer periods of time, and in all areas we see some very big differences in terms of the amount of organisms an individual can catch and comparing that to the amount of effort that's being put out. Now, in general, we have seen a huge increase in the amount of effort, so the quantity of fish are still being caught at a high level, but in general that's because there's so much more effort being put in. The other problem with overfishing is that you can't see the entire population. You can't fly over like you would with a herd of elephants or other things like that. You can't count the number of individuals that are left. And so what biologists can do, what fisheries biologists do, is they make estimates. And these estimates are based on catch and release programs. They're based on the reproductive capacity of the species, so the biology of the species, the catch per unit effort, and a lot of different variables, but they're still estimates. And so a lot of fishermen are reluctant to completely buy in and reduce the amount of fishing they're doing because they say, well, it's just an estimate. And that's that same issue in terms of like the layperson's understanding of what an estimate is versus what a scientist means by an estimate. Exacerbating that problem is the fact that a lot of the fisheries ways of catching fish are damaging populations and damaging habitat, not to mention other activities that we have, especially things like runoff from land and other things, the pollution that cause the habitats to be destroyed, not just of the adult fishing grounds, but also of the nursery areas. So mangrove forest is being destroyed in one area. One of its ecosystem services is nursery ground for important fish species. And so we see a problem in terms of the fish species elsewhere going on decline. And then in general, with the growing population of humans and with our understanding of healthy fats from fishes and less healthy meat options, we see a serious uptick in the amount of demand for fish. And of course, this just makes things worse because with higher demand, you get more bycatch, overfishing is a problem, and the habitat destruction when it has to do with fishing practices can also be a problem. So those are some of the major issues, and next we'll talk a little bit about some solutions. When we're looking at potential solutions for fishing problems, we're looking at how do we regulate the amount of fishing that happens, so that helps prevent overfishing, and then also what can we do about this whole issue of bycatch. In fisheries biology, take means to harm or to capture an organism. So that's not just physically taking it out, but it also means damaging the other organisms and making them less fit for survival. So first thing you can look at is the actual gear itself. You can have things placed into the device that will actually prevent certain endangered species from getting caught. One example here is a turtle exclusion device, which is put in a trawl net. Fish are going to swim through these bars and still get captured in the long end of the trawl, but a larger organism like a sea turtle, which is endangered, all sea turtles are endangered, is not going to fit through those bars. It's going to be directed upward towards a loose flap of net, which is called an escape hatch. And so you can have devices like that. There are other fish exclusion devices for shrimp fishing. Things like that can be required. You can also set limits on the size of the net, and this could be something like the length of the net itself, but it can also refer to the hole size in the net so that smaller juveniles are let through because they don't get caught. And then hooks can also be restricted. Here's an example of a conventional hook on those long line fishing. And what you'll notice is that it's got a very straight up and down barb at the end, and a lot of organisms can get caught on that, whereas a circle hook is not going to be as easy for a seabird or other types of organisms to get caught on it, but is still going to catch the target species. And so these are required for certain types of long line fishing. So you can definitely have restrictions on the gear that is used. You can also restrict the number of people and the amount of fishing that's done. For example, you can only have a set number of ships out, and that's based on permits. An individual ship is only allowed to bring in a certain quantity of fish. That's referred to as a catch limit, and that's very common these days. The other thing that we tend to restrict with legislation is when and where this can happen. So for example, you have seasons, just like you do with any kind of hunting. In some areas, we're talking about 2 weeks, a season that's only 2 weeks long. I have an experience with that in Baja California with scallops, where it was literally 2 weeks, and people came in from all over the place, and it in some ways can have some unintended consequences, because then you have very, 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 very heavy use of that resource for a very short period of time, which can have some detrimental effects. Other regions, if the fish stock is better, it might be several months that you're allowed to fish for that, and it really matters what the species is, what the research shows, where the location is, etc. And this can also help protect species during very important times, so you're not allowed to fish during, say, the reproductive periods when organisms are trying to find each other and make babies and replenish the population. So seasons can be about when you can, and also they can be about when you can't go fishing. Another tool is to restrict where fishing happens, and obviously you can have fishing grounds, but you can also have very specific set-aside areas where no fishing is permitted. These are usually referred to as marine protected areas. If they're highly protected, you can have marine reserves. We have a couple of those in the United States. And the idea with a marine protected area, or an MPA, is that the right size, so in this situation we have a medium reserve, the right size will allow protection within that area And some of the fish will stay there naturally. But as the population grows, some of the organisms will leave to find new food sources, and eventually the fishermen will have basically a source of fish that's constantly feeding the fishing grounds. If the reserve is too small, that's going to happen when fish disperse and they're not really going to have enough protection. Their population isn't going to be protected. If a reserve is too large, it's not necessarily going to have the intended consequence of replenishing the fishing area, and so that's not going to have economic benefits to an area. So somebody, a fisheries biologist who is planning this, has to really take into account the way that the species functions, how far it disperses, and what the needs are of the economy, so that it can be a functional and useful tool. So those are the main problems and solutions to fishing and fisheries. And if you have questions, please make sure you ask me. Thanks.